Okay. All right, well, welcome everybody, everyone in the room and everyone who's watching on webcast. My name's Kevin Banks. I'm the director of the Center for Law in the Contemporary Workplace here at Queen's Law, and I'm delighted to welcome Roger Martin as our Douglas Cunningham visitor in labor and employment law. Now, Dean Martin has served as the dean of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto for the past 15 years. His research covers a wide range of topics from integrative thinking, business design, corporate social responsibility, country competitiveness, and the relationship between markets and executive compensation, which is going to be the topic of his talk today and was the topic of a very thought-provoking book called Fixing the Game, which he published a couple of years ago, about a year and a half ago, I guess. That is one of 8 books that he's published, many from published by Harvard University Press and other major publishers. Roger is a very well-known thinker in the business world. He placed 6th on the Thinkers 50 list, which is a biannual ranking of the most influential global business thinkers in 2011. So we've got some big ideas from someone who's really got the big picture, and I'm really delighted that Roger could join us today and talk to us about fixing the game. So with that, let's give him a big warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. And I spend most of my time trying to figure out stuff that confuses me and stuff that doesn't work the way you'd think it would work. And so I will start with an example of that, and that is if you took 2 companies. Okay. Are we okay? Yeah. 2 companies. American, publicly traded, widely held companies. They both get a new CEO January 1, 2007. And like modern CEOs, they both retire December 31st, 2011. So they're on the job for 5 years. They get a very bog standard compensation package for the modern American big company CEO, half stock-based compensation. It can either be half options or half DSUs, RSUs. If you want to be politically correct, they're restricted stock, and half salary. Let's just say $5 million of each, and they get their stock-based compensation January 1 of each year, which is the traditional system. So you've got these 2, and one we're going to call Bill, and the other we're going to call Ed. And Bill manages his company so that the stock price turns out to follow the S&P 500 exactly, precisely. So he takes over the company, and the stock is 100 on the day he took it over. It rises by October 2007 to about 115, which is when the S&P 500 actually hits the highest point in its entire history. It then plummets down to a price of 45 by March of 2009, and then slowly but steadily recovers, so that he retires the day it is $88. So we call him Bill because it's Thrill-A-Minute Bill. He takes his shareholders on a wild ride, up, then way down, then summit back up. Ed, Steady Eddie, somehow manages his company so that its stock price, never changes. It's 100 every day for the 5 years. Starts at 100 and ends at 100. So he ends $12 per share higher than Thrill Bill. So the little test is, as of December 31st, 2011, who has been compensated more in the 5 years? Thrill-A-Minute Bill or Steady Eddie? Who do we think? So 12% higher and no volatility for Eddie, 12% lower and massive volatility for Bill.
My rich book, it's Bill.
No, it's Eddie. It's Eddie, yeah. Right? Or sorry, no, I get that. You're right. It's Bill. How on earth does Bill end up with more compensation? Because when he's at the end, and especially it's DSUs, right? Or options, at the end, it's worth $12 a share less, 12% less than Steady Eddie. How can that be? How can that be? No guesses? Yes?
Because when it gets monetized, he gets it issued at, say, 45. And so $100 buys a whole lot more shares at $45 a share, and then it goes up to 80.
That's right. It's those shares that he got, DSUs or options that he got January 1, 2008, and January 2009 in particular. Those are really good ones. And even the 2010s, he made lots of money on it. And so he makes dramatically more money than Steady Eddie if it's options, but he makes significantly more still if it's DSUs. So why on earth would we have a system that looks like that? Is that really what we want? And if you think about it from incentive terms, right? I always think incentives, often people who design incentive compensation speak with forked tongue. They do not want to be logically consistent. So they want to say incentives matter, so that's why we spend all this time designing incentive compensation. But then they want to deny what those incentives actually cause the person to do, right? And so you can have two conditions, right? Incentives don't matter at all and don't influence behavior whatsoever. And then, so what is the utility to shareholders or the planet in general of having incentive compensation? What's the utility? Right? Zero. Or incentive compensation actually drives behavior, right? So then you have to take account of, if you're a proponent of incentive compensation, you have to argue that they do drive behavior, and then you have to ask the question, in what fashion do they drive behavior? Right? And what we've just learned, that if incentive compensation matters and you want more rather than less, and you can influence your company as a CEO, because of course, if you can't influence your company as a CEO, then what's the utility of incentive compensation? Nil, right? It's worthless. You're throwing money down the toilet. So what do we learn from this just little example, tiny little example of what those two CEOs, if they're after attempting to maximize their compensation, what do they have an incentive to do? Produce volatility. Lots of volatility. In fact, if you want to maximize your incentive compensation in the modern economy, the very smartest thing you can possibly do as a CEO is take over a company as CEO, and then the very next day declare, oh my God, now that I've seen the books, it's a disaster. It's just awful, terrible. We've got to do a massive restructuring with huge layoffs to get this company back on its feet. I'm so sad to hear what a bad job my predecessor did to mess the company up so much. Right? That's a fantastic strategy if you actually are influenced by incentive compensation. Right? Because what happens? Stock plummets. So it's 100, goes down to $50. and you have an excuse to do all sorts of slashing and hacking. And then, miraculously, as long as you're not a complete moron, the company recovers back to $100. Shareholders during your tenure, and then you retire. As soon as it gets back to 100, during your time, shareholders have made how much money? 0. How much money have you made? Vast quantities. Vast quantities. So why do we have the incentive compensation we have? Well, the reason we have the incentive compensation we have goes back. Oh, that does not want to. There we go. Has to do with something that happened back in late 1976. I'll discuss the something in a minute. But it's interesting to ask the question, what happened to a few things before and after? And I wrote the book in 2011, so I just took it up to 2010. If you looked at the 33 years after this blessed event in 1976 versus before, what you find is that real returns to shareholders, these are the total returns to shareholders on the S&P 500 adjusted for inflation, went down 15% over that period. You could say, well, that's okay because maybe they had less risk. So if they were getting paid for less volatility, that's okay. But what happened to volatility over that period? Using the broadest measures of volatility went up. So shareholders used to get more for taking on less risk before, and after they get less for taking on more risk. And that's just the normal daily volatility in the market. In addition, if you ask the question, how many complete total meltdowns were there of the market in the 33 years before this blessed event versus the 33 after? The answer is 0, and we had 2 here, one of which we're still living through the consequences of it. So it's a sort of a big-time meltdown. So what happened is shareholders absolutely took it in the teeth after 76 versus before. Now, was it bad for everyone, we might ask? The answer is no, because this is S&P 500 executive compensation in 2010 dollars, so I had inflated it up, $850 per back in 1976, and $14 million per in 2010. So while the shareholders were taking it in the teeth, absolutely, these guys, this is pretty good, right? This is a nice, more than 10x advance. And they weren't the only ones who have done marvelously well. These other creatures started doing really nicely. And so this is not corporate compensation. This is not how much Appaloosa made or Soros Fund Management. This is how much David Tepper made in personal cash compensation in year. This isn't appreciation of share value. This is a check written to him for $4 billion for 2008. Now, I don't know how many of you had a stock portfolio in 2008. How did yours do in 2008? So while yours was doing what? Going down the toilet. Tepper was making $4 billion. George Soros was making $3.3. James Simons, $2.5. John Paulson, remember him? The nice guy who helped wreck the mortgage securities market, $2.3 billion. Stephen Cohen, you know all about him, right? You've been reading about him. More and more traders in SAC Capital are now under indictment than any other firm. There's a great Business Week cover story on just how it appears SAC Capital makes the money they do. Who knows? It's alleged at this point for Cohen. But so these people did enormously well during that period. So the question is, how on earth can we have a system that changed so dramatically and made it so dramatically worse for shareholders and dramatically better for CEOs and hedge fund managers? To understand that, you have to understand that there are two different games that are relating to one another and interacting in a way that produce these odd results. One game is what I call the real game, and the other game is the expectations game. The real game is the game where companies, in this case a car company, builds real factories and produces real cars, which they sell to real people for real money, and they make either a real profit or a real loss at the end of the year. Right? That's the real market. All of that stuff is real. You can kind of put your fingers on it and touch it, and it's real. Associated with that is something I call an expectations market, where people called investors look at this market and imagine what's going to happen in the future. And on the basis of that, they decide how much they're willing to pay for a little sliver of this real company. Now, most people don't really internalize the degree to which that market is entirely ethereal. Most people imagine it has something to do with this. But in fact, this market is 100% in the realm of expectations. It's the collective view of what will happen in the future to this company, which is what? It is unknowable. Nobody can know that for sure. It's all of our imaginations, all loaded up together to produce, at any given time, an equilibrium price where half of the people think the future is rosier than that price would suggest, and half of the people think the future is less rosy than that price would indicate. Right? Now, these markets did not used to be tied together. Prior to 1976, 1% of CEO compensation in large American companies was in the form of stock-based compensation. So executives were actually compensated for real performance. They got a base salary, they got bonuses based on real things. What's your market share? What's your return on equity? What's your earnings per share? Those were all real features. And why this is really important is these things do not travel together as much as people would think. So here's Microsoft, right? We had this event here, the dot-com bust, and at that point, Microsoft and everybody else's stock went down. And so post the dot-com bust, this here, right here, what you'll see, right, is in blue the stock price of Microsoft, a non-dividend paying stock throughout that whole period, and its net income. So the red you should think of as the real market. And so how did Microsoft do in the real market from the end of the bust going forward? Spectacularly, right? That's nothing short of spectacular, because this is a big company, and for a big company to grow its net income from $5 billion to $19 billion in a decade, that's about as good as it gets. What happened in the expectations market? Nothing. Nothing. Right? Check this out. Right? That's the same number as that. So these two things do not follow one another. They vary greatly from one another. And why? Why do you think this is the same as that?
Microsoft just consistently met expectations, and expectations weren't increasing.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. So they expected something that looked like this, and when they got something that looked like this, the meeting and exceeding of expectations, they said, yeah, right, exactly. You did exactly what we thought you were going to do, and so what we thought you were going to do, same, and so the price stays the same. So those two things have got a very kind of tenuous relationship between them, and before 1976 were not tied together. And why do I draw the line here? Because of the single most cited article in the history of all business academic writing. Right? This is one that I assume they've all read, Theory of the Firm, Jensen and Meckling, Journal of Financial Economics, 1976, which, in my view, what created a dividing line between a period here and a period here, because that article made the argument that there's a thing called agency costs, that the principals and the agents have a schism between them, and the way that you can fix that schism is by aligning the interests of management and shareholders with stock-based compensation. It was this fundamental theory of alignment. And it was a deceptively simple theory. Like, deceptively simple theories tend to really work well, whether they make sense or not, right? Because they just sound so good. It's what we call, I work a lot for Procter & Gamble, it's what Procter & Gamble calls kitchen logic. So it's like the logic of baking soda peroxide toothpaste. So you put baking soda in your refrigerator and it cleans the air. Therefore, if you put it in your toothpaste, it should clean your teeth. And that gets you a really decent market share for baking soda peroxide toothpaste. It doesn't really do even a medium good job cleaning your teeth, but it sounds like a fantastic theory. And this is the same theory, which says, here's the deal. We're going to create stock-based compensation, right? So that if shareholders do well, who else does well? Management. If shareholders do badly, who does badly? Management. Alignment. It's perfect. It's just wonderful. That was the theory, right? And then you get these problems, right? Just won't go back. You get these problems, right, where, it's not completely kind of aligned, and you get Bill and Eddie, and you say, wow, it's actually completely disaligned, because what is stock as an incentive? If the price of a stock is 100% the cumulative expectations of all players in the market, it's an incentive. Stock-based compensation is an incentive to do what? Increase expectations from their current level, whatever that level happens to be. Right? If you get stock-based compensation and you've gone public, Facebook, at 100 times earnings, that stock-based compensation will be worth more only under what circumstance? Expectations are higher still sometime in the future than they are today. Right? So it is always and everywhere an incentive to increase expectations from their current level. Now, the interesting thing, and why the best, if you want to get rich, there's one way to get rich now in the world that's much better than any other way, is to be a hedge fund manager. Right? Hedge fund management now will probably in 2013 Forbes 400 list of the 400 richest Americans will overtake high tech as the number one way to become a billionaire in America. It's closed the gap from, in 2000, there were 89 of the 500 were high tech and 3 were hedge fund managers. In 2012, the gap's close to 43 to 38. So, and what's the reason, if you think about it? Hedge funds have got it so much better than managers. So managers have got it great. Like, this is a goofball game that somebody made up that just makes these people just crazy rich. But what do they tend to have to be vis-a-vis their stock? Long. So volatility of one sort is better for them. What about hedge funds? Couldn't care less. could not care less whether stocks are going up or down. All they care is that they move a lot. All right. So what we have is a situation where we've created an incentive to manipulate expectations. Okay? And if you're a manager, the incentive is to manipulate expectations down and sacrifice so that $100 DSUs that Thrill Bill gets, he has to sort of kiss them goodbye, get the stock down so that he gets some more to get the stock back up, because it's a lot easier to get the stock back up when you get it down nicely. So we have an odd theory that produces the opposite of what we wanted. It lowers returns and increases volatility, and it was supposed to align the interests of management and shareholders. So I say, is this the only way to manage compensation and manage the existence of a real market and an expectations market? And I say, no, there's a better way. And to find that better way, we have to go to the National Football League. So we've just been through the Super Bowl. Right? It's the biggest sport in America, a $10 billion sport. But that's the revenues for the real game. The ability to add up how much money is actually spent in the expectations game, which is what? Betting on NFL football games, might be bigger than the real game in size. And how do you think? And so in the NFL, of course, there's a real game and an expectation game. What's the real game? It's what we saw on Sunday. Two teams go out on a real field with 60 real minutes and have real passes and real runs, real field goals, real touchdowns. There's a real winner and a real loser and a real score. Associated with that is an expectations game. Monday through Saturday, or for the 2 weeks during Super Bowl build-up, bettors imagine what they think is going to happen on Sunday, and on the basis of that, they place bets. And just like a stock price, the bookies in Las Vegas adjust continuously the line, the betting line, and it's like a stock price in that it adjusts continuously, and it's adjusted so as to have 50% of people above and below. So the underdog, in that case, the underdog who won, was given 4.5 points. So if you bet on the Baltimore Ravens in the Super Bowl on Sunday, all they had to do is either win or lose by 4 points or less, and you would win the bet. For you to win betting on San Francisco, they had to win by 5 points or more for you to win. So that's how it works. It's exactly the same as a stock price. So they have those two games that relate to one another and in some sense have to be managed. How does the NFL look at that? Well, they look at that a lot differently. And it stems all the way back to 1961 when this large gentleman, Alex Karros, was the best defensive player in the league. And this gentleman here, Paul Hornung, was the best offensive player in the league and the MVP. And they both were caught betting $50 on an NFL game, not even one they were playing in. And they were both booted out of the league for 1 year by then young Commissioner Pete Rozelle. Booted out of the league for a year. Think of that now. You took the best. If Sidney Crosby bet $50, booting him out of the league for a year. We're talking big time. So what was Pete Rozelle so fussed about? Right? Why was he so fussed? Because he worried that their interests in the expectations game would influence how they played in the real game so that they would make their bet in the expectations game come through for them, make more money. And so it's gotten more severe. Now if you're ever caught betting even once, you're kicked out for life. So isn't it, or at least to me, maybe I'm weird, but to me it's kind of odd. We've got this exact same structure real game and expectations game. And in one, business, they force the key individuals, boards of directors, senior management, to play extensively in the expectations game. And in the other one, they absolutely forbid playing in the expectations game. And the reasons are in football are real, right? So if they had compensation structure in NFL like they had in business, at the end of the Super Bowl, right, if the 49ers would have scored the touchdown, right, and gone up, they would have gone up by less than 4.5 points by scoring the touchdown. They were down 5 points. They would have been up by 2 points. And there would have been about a minute, if they would have scored on that fourth down play instead, there would have been about a minute and a half left. If they would have been in business, what would have they done? What would have the coach ordered them to do? Onside kick. Yeah, because you're going to lose against the spread. Yes, you'll win the Super Bowl, blah, 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 but you'll lose against the spread, and that's where all the money is. You've done an extremely risky onside kick, which Baltimore could have recovered, gone down for a field goal with a minute left, and won the game. So that's what NFL football does not want to have happen. The queering of the real game because of the motivations of the expectations game. So the question really is, why? Why, oh why, do we have a dominant compensation system that disaligns the interests of shareholders and management, that creates a gigantic hedge fund industry that is in concert with the CEOs? CEOs like Thrill-A-Minute Bill learned over time, it took them, you can look in the data and you can see when this came into being for the first 10 or 15 years, CEOs thought if you improved the real performance, you would make lots of money on your stock-based compensation. Then they learned a lesson the hard way, said, no, that's not how it works. You got to jerk around expectations maximally. And as they did more and more of that, what industry grew up side by side, cheek by jowl with that? The hedge fund industry, who says, we got all these CEOs jerking things around. This is perfect for us, more volatility where we get to make more money still. And that's the result of a theory, the theory of alignment. There's a better theory. The NFL is smarter than capitalism. And it's because we have kitchen logic working for us, not something sensible. So those are my thoughts, and I'm happy to take any or all questions, attacks, confused thoughts, whatever you've got. Yes, ma'am. And tell me who you are. I would be interested to know. Who are you?
I'm Trish Appleyard. I'm with the Center for Law in the Contemporary Workplace, and I'm also a PhD candidate here at Queen's in labor law. I wanted to ask you how you thought Sarbanes-Oxley has affected executive compensation. Last year we had Lynn Stout from UCLA.
Who is a dear friend of mine. I love her.
And she was saying that she felt one of the issues was that because of SOX's onerous reporting requirements and its rules, that the idea of non-monetary compensation got kicked to the curb. So keys to the corporate washroom, access to the corporate jet, those types of perks weren't allowed under the SOX regime. And so they had to move to monetary compensation that could really be closely monitored and written down and reported. And so that's what's led to the higher salaries and the stock options. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I wouldn't actually on this one concur with Lynn on that diagnosis, because that presumes, right, that somehow corporate execs needed some other compensation for those things going away, and I just don't believe that that's the case. Sarbanes-Oxley, I think, is a travesty, and it's made the world a substantially worse place. And if you just tore it up, the world would become a better place. So it's just a colossal waste of money, and it's a bureaucrat's wet dream, basically. It's sort of like an imagination that you can sort of get rid of all kind of risks by making sure your controls are controlled. Like I watched this on 2 big boards I'm on, and we spend tens of millions of dollars on really fantasy exercises where we have to do all this. We sort of have to, it's almost like the auditors say, if you can jump like this a bunch of times, I'll declare that you have proper controls on that system. And it's insanity. I think what really has gotten CEO compensation continuing to rise is the more sophisticated playing of the game by CEOs. So what I see is a system where the players have gotten so much more sophisticated from 1980 onward, and by the 2000s they had figured out the game to absolute perfection and know exactly how to play the game, how long to stay, how much to jerk stock prices around in exactly the right way to maximize your incentives. And that would be more, in my view, the driver of ever higher compensation, a more sophisticated gaming of the game. Every game gets gamed by the gamers who have the most to benefit from it, and we've sort of left the fundamentals of the game alone, and so we should expect the gamers to be more sophisticated, and the people trying to prevent the games from being gamed have got terrible intellectual technology. So they don't understand and in fact do things like Sarbanes-Oxley that if anything just bureaucratize a system and not do anything useful. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Jeff. I'm a first-year law student at Queens. I actually used to work at Procter & Gamble. I
Did you?
quit P&G to go back to school. Yeah, I worked in sales and marketing, so I can attest to your kitchen logic and the onerous sort of obligations of SOX. But my question is, do you feel like CEOs are forced to play the game? Are there cases where there are benevolent CEOs that don't act in that sphere and aren't motivated by incentivization? And then, if so, how do they compete in a world where expectations are that high? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think your thesis is absolutely right. There is a great diversity of CEOs. There are some CEOs who I just think are lots and lots of CEOs are not motivated at all by money. On them, incentive compensation is completely wasted, so it's just a waste of money, but that doesn't damage company performance. So, A.G. Lafley, who you would have had probably as a CEO while you were there, yeah, A.G. Lafley, one of the finest CEOs of his generation, just couldn't care less about his compensation. It was like whatever the board gave him, whatever, doesn't matter. And he even went to the board and said, this stock-based compensation. He had an influence by someone, I think. This stock-based compensation is kind of set up in a goofy way. It's not making me think long-term enough. Here's what I want to do. I want to take all of my stock-based compensation, and rather than vesting a third in the first 3 years after my retirement, I want to make it vest a tenth for each year. So he only gets his stock-based compensation fully paid out 10 years after retirement. And so, and I asked him, I remember asking him, I said, AG, when he bought Gillette, they paid $53 billion for Gillette, and Jim Kiltz, who's sort of the corporate turnaroundy kind of guy who dresses up companies and sells them to make piles of money for himself, made $350 million on the deal for having worked there for I think 5 or 6 years after they did the Nabisco thing where he made another $500 million. And I said, AG, you've worked for P&G for 30 years. You've bought them, so you've outperformed them. You get to buy them, so your performance is dramatically better. And you're going to make over those 30 years about $150 million. Does it kind of piss you off a little to see Kiltz walking away with $350? And he said, oh, no, absolutely not. Roger, for starters, what am I going to do with $150 million? As if I need that kind of money. And I'm not the guy who has to explain to my city why I've just sold out from underneath them their company, right? Jim Kiltz has to tell the people of Boston why he sold their best industrial company. You know, they've also to financial companies, but they're by far and away their best industrial company is Gillette. And said, I don't have to explain anything to the people of Cincinnati. In fact, I just made us bigger and stronger. So I think you got a bunch of CEOs like that. But you know, I could make an argument that Procter & Gamble probably wasted at least $100 million of that compensation on AG. It did nothing for the shareholders. He couldn't care less. $50 million, you'd have probably said, oh, that's too much money too. And frankly, I mean, I hang out with CEOs like all the time. I have for the last 30 years been consulting mainly to like big company CEOs. And there's not a single CEO that I've consulted to who thinks they need the money they're being paid. They don't. They just don't. And for a lot of them, it's a real burden. They got to set up a big, you know, lots of them are very charitable. They got to set up a foundation and create a foundation board and then figure out how to give the money away and all that kind of stuff. It's sort of like a big irritation. And so I think we misinterpret completely the nature of people. And again, let's again think about it. If you want the CEO to be really motivated by incentive compensation, kind of like what sorts of things are they going to do? How about with employees? Fire them, right? If profitability and the street gets upset at you, you just fire a bunch of people, get your profits up in the short term, and who cares? You're only going to be there for a few years anyway. What do customers think? Your message to customers: we're here to increase shareholder value. What are the customers saying? Like, oh, like what? What about me? I pay you all the money, and you're not interested in maximizing my value. And employees, you tell the employees, the purpose of our company, maximize shareholder value. So you could have a sort of a naive, fresh-faced employee say, okay, fair enough. Who are these shareholders anyway? And if you're going to be honest with them, you'll have to say, we actually don't know. What do you mean you don't know? Well, the vast majority of our shareholder roster are people like Fidelity, Vanguard, whatever, and they don't actually own the stock. They don't even tell us who kind of own the stock, and the stock they all own is in street form. It's not actually registered to anybody. And then you say, okay, so we don't know who they are, but do we at least know they kind of stay around for a while, and so we can have a real relationship with them. If we do good things for them, they'll kind of be nice to us. And you say, well, actually our entire corporate stock holdings turns over every 3 months. And so you say, okay, let me get this right. I am supposed to get up every morning, get into my car, drive to work to maximize the value for some faceless, nameless people who we have no idea who they are, who can blow us off at the drop of a hat and not give us any rationale for that. And that's my motivation for coming to work. It's insane. No wonder 70% of employees are disengaged, right? Like, would you be engaged by that? That's motivational to you? A bunch of faceless, nameless people who blow us off. So it's just, so you need a very strong CEO like Lafley, like now Paul Pullman. You've probably been reading about Paul Pullman at Unilever, who's a Procter guy, who I used to work with. Did you work with Paul? Probably not. He was in Europe while you were where you were. I actually worked a whole lot with him. I like to think I taught him strategy. He says that. Great guy, really smart guy, and he got to Unilever, and the day he got there, he said, "I'm stopping quarterly guidance. Quarterly guidance is a really bad idea. I'm not managing this company for quarters. I'm managing this company for the long term, and you guys will be better off." And he said, "And if you don't like that, I have a solution for you. Sell the stock and don't ever buy it again." Right? Because if you don't like that, you're never going to like me, because I'm not going to ever give you quarterly guidance. and I'm going to minimize to the amount that's statutorily required in terms of my disclosure on a quarterly basis, because quarterly disclosures tells you nothing useful about anything. And so I'll try and minimize that. And if you don't like it, get out of here. Stock went down at first, but it's now way back up, and he's managing for the long term. So I think you need a CEO. But I would argue that CEOs like A.G. Lafley and Paul Pullman are insubordinate. Because if you're given incentive compensation by your board of directors, right, what should you be trying to do what the board wants? Maximize the value of your incentive compensation, right? If you're not trying that, you're insubordinate. Right? You're not doing what they say you should be doing. So I would argue Steady Eddie was insubordinate. He was not attempting to make his stock-based compensation worth as much as it could be. Thrill-a-Minute Bill was the one who was actually being a good boy. He was doing what his board wanted him to do. He was figuring out how to get the biggest payoff to his incentive compensation. Right? So AG, Paul Pullman are insubordinate. They're not paying attention to what their board is asking them to do. Now, boards speak with forked tongue too. They'll say, "Oh, we're supposed to grow this company for the long term, and here's your pile of incentive compensation," right? As if they're sort of saying, do not pay attention to that man behind the curtain, right? It's sort of like, don't, we're going to tell you to do this, and sort of we're going to give you that stock-based compensation, but you aren't really supposed to do what the stock-based compensation would say. But we're giving it to you anyway, and if you ask us why, it's because that'll motivate you to do things that are good, but it's in fact in strict contrast to what we said over here we want you to do, but, you figure it out, you're the CEO. That is the nature of governance in the modern economy.
Just kind of going back to your incentives and stuff like that, and I was wondering if you could kind of make a comment on, if you don't give them incentives and they get a huge contract, they just kind of sit there and they can do nothing. So isn't it more of an issue of aligning making the incentives align with the shareholder goals and using more of a balanced scorecard approach, and, with qualitative and quantitative factors on it, as well as short-term and long-term indicators? Yeah. And I wondered what your thoughts on that would be at kind of those high levels. Sure.
A couple things. So the argument that I've made today thus far is not an argument against incentive compensation. It's an argument against stock-based incentive compensation. So compensation that's based on the expectations market, not the real market. What you referred to were a bunch of measures that mainly, like most balanced scorecard type measures and the like, are what I'd call real measures. It's get your employee satisfaction up to this, get your market share up to that. Those are all real things. They have nothing to do with the expectations market. So in my view, that's superior. And I would say if you really want monetary incentive compensation, the rule in my head is stay away completely from the the expectations market and stay completely in the real market. The problem, though, with that is the latest research on the power of monetary incentive compensation is turning really negative. So one thing you should know is that there's never been in all of business research a research study that can show a positive correlation between incentive compensation and corporate performance. Isn't that amazing? We have entire departments in companies that spend all their waking moments designing incentive compensation schemes, and there is no proof. There's as much proof of the positive power of incentive compensation, monetary incentive compensation to drive corporate performance, as there is proof of the Loch Ness Monster. They're exactly the same level of proof. None in history. Now, piled on top of that are all of these these behavioral economists now are doing all these experiments. Guys like Dan Ariely and Nina Mazur, who's at our shop, that are demonstrating that monetary compensation works very differently for tasks that are physical versus tasks that are mental. So if I said to you, what's your name? Sorry, Jeff. So if I said to Jeff, see that pile of rocks over there? They're there now. I want you to move them over there, and then back to there, and back to there, and back to there. And the more times you do that in the next hour, the more I'm going to pay you. It turns out that if I give you incentive compensation like that, you'll move more rocks. And if I give you higher incentive compensation, a steeper curve, you'll move even more rocks. And that's how we think incentive compensation works generally. But it turns out if I say, Jeff, here's a set of differential equations, and you've got an hour, and if you can solve 2 of them, I'll give you $50. If you can solve 5 of them, I'll give you $5,000. And if you can solve all 10 of them, I'll give you $1 million. You will produce dramatically worse results, statistically significantly worse results than if I do one of 2 things. One, say, I'll give you $10 if you get 2, I'll give you $20 if you get 5, and I'll give you $30 if you get all 10. You'll do better. You'll get more equations solved, more problems solved, and you do even better if I just say, listen, just work hard at it, and if you're kind of working hard at it, I'll give you $30, regardless of how you perform. So it just turns out that human beings, and Peter Drucker, right? Peter Drucker, the wisest management thinker in the history of the planet. Peter Drucker made this observation about knowledge workers in 1956 when he coined the term. He said, work has changed. We used to hire people for their arms and legs and strong backs. And his theory was you can sort of kind of separate yourself in some sense, who you are, from your arms, legs, and strong back, and sort of disassociate from that work. But the minute we have you do knowledge work, where you're using your brain, you're using kind of your soul, you can't dissociate from it. It is you, and is so much more personal. And he said, the knowledge workers, we're going to have to treat them more like volunteers, as if they're working for a nonprofit and they're volunteering their time. We've got to have them be motivated intrinsically to want to be doing the tasks they're doing. We can't pay them lots to do better because it's so much them. Their work product is themselves, as opposed to their work product is a car and they screwed a bolt on the assembly line. They can disassociate themselves and say, that's not me. But all of you guys are going to do knowledge work. That's why you're here. You're going to do knowledge work, and your work is you, because you're using your brain. And we haven't figured that out. He figured that out because he's smarter than everybody in the entire management world, and he figured it out so long ago it's embarrassing. But we still think that we can apply incentives associated for the physical world for strong arms, legs, hard work, sweat, toil of that sort, to the modern knowledge work. And it just doesn't work. And we just got to get over the fantasy. And so it's a long answer to your question, but my answer would be it's non-monetary incentives. I think, what do you think you guys are going to work at your law jobs for? Is it really, are you going to write a little bit better legal brief because they're going to pay you $1,000 more at the end of the year? Do you really think so? Or are you going to work for what? Pride. For feeling good about the work you've done. For having your client be able to accomplish something that you think is good for your client to accomplish. To build the reputation of your firm. To be a valued member of a colleagueship in the firm of other people who are using what's between their ears. I think that's what's going to motivate you. And so I think the culture of a company, an organization, is going to have much more influence on performance than monetary incentive compensation. And in fact, I think we're going to find more and more as time goes on that monetary incentive compensation works directly against the success of the company because it alienates employees, it alienates customers, and is tied up in an expectations game that is game for the worse. So that gets a little existential, but I think you asked a complicated question, a good and complicated question, and the answer is sort of a long way from where we are now. It's a bunch of steps away from where we are now, and I think we're going to have to go through whatever the 4 stages of dying are about this theory. Theories die hard, and I think it took 30 or so years for this theory to absolutely dominate the entire business world, and it's probably going to take 20 or 25 for it to be disassembled. Yes, sir.
So the NFL has Pete Rozelle, who cares about what fans think of the game. We don't have that kind of centralized control over anything that goes on in the corporate world. We're probably on the whole happy for that, but what should public policymakers who care about the productivity of our enterprises and the motivation of our workforce be thinking about in order to spur the death of the theory, as you put it?
Well, so it's a good point. I mean, the NFL analogy only goes so far because it's one kind of league and it's bite-sized enough to have the commissioner running it. But what I'd say is I think public policymakers just have to be more picky about their theories. They have to have stuff like some demonstrated proof of a theory working. How about that? Right? As opposed to just making shit up. I mean, that would be it. I mean, I think even if it's a distributed world, which it for sure is, there isn't one public policy organ that's going to do it. It's if their theories were just held to higher standards. Wouldn't you think, if we've been around this long having incentive compensation and there still isn't any study that associates it with corporate performance? And one of the reasons it's not associated with corporate performance, right, part of it is the link with individual performance isn't as strong as we thought, but it turns out that coordinating people's individual incentives is enormously difficult. Right? So you may have an incentive to do something that you'll maximize, but you and your friend here have joint products that you have to actually sort of produce together in some way collaboratively. But he's got an incentive compensation system that says he shouldn't pay any attention to yours, you shouldn't pay any attention to his, and you both max out your compensation, and the corporation does terribly. So anyway, I would say that's what we've got to do. I think we are in some sense managing the business world and regulating the business world based on superstition. It's sort of like, if we draw enough blood, the black blood will eventually come out and you'll be healed. That's the way we're regulating the business world.
Don't you make some of your argument easier by picking Microsoft as an example because it's a non-dividend paying stock? Like, isn't some of the irrationality that a stock price for it has been driven in the absence of dividend? Like the classic model is, I like the dividend profile, so I'm going to pay more for the stock.
Yeah, I use Microsoft because dividends don't confuse the analogy. I mean, I think it's a very good point, and there would be people who would say, and in fact, Myron Gordon, the great Rotman, the first great Rotman professor, who's invented what's called the Gordon growth model. That says the valuation is based on the dividend, kind of dividend yield of stocks. So that dividend is what? Expectations are real. It's real money. You literally get a check for it. So I would be biased towards anything that gets you more into the real world and away from the expectations world, the better. Right? So if you're buying a stock because it has a super high dividend yield, I like that better than you buying a stock that's 100% about the expectations market. So yeah, I gave a more pure play example, and the stock with a relatively high dividend would be a more mixed mode. The same things still work, but not in the same, probably to the same extreme extent.
still get odd behavior. You might well have a management that pays out too much money if it's driven by dividends.
Yes.
And
Yes.
you don't grow. So
Yeah, no. If they think a big jump in the dividend payout in a given year will drive the stock price up, perhaps just before they retire,
Right.
they might just do that. Yes.
What happens to the expectation market if you were to separate executives' compensation? Because that's the only link right now between the two. If you sever that tie, what happens to this expectation market?
I think the world gets to be a better place. So you'd have CEOs not worrying, not spending their time talking to Wall Street, giving Wall Street guidance, doing acquisitions that they shouldn't to hype the stock. You'd have them focusing on building real value and real companies, and the stock market would do what the stock market does. So I think you would diminish the problem. Would you eliminate it? No, but you diminish it. And I think if you ever got into that, if you ever got into a world where there was lobbying for and a movement towards doing what you've said, do you know who would be putting tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying against it? The hedge fund industry, because they'd say, no, we like the CEOs jerking everything around. That makes us rich. Don't do that. And they'd make all sorts of ludicrous arguments, ludicrous, baseless arguments for why it's against Americanism or something. But so that's what I think would happen, which would be just would ameliorate all the tendencies that I've described.
I'm wondering how this plays out in the context of privately owned as opposed to public companies.
So it's a very good question. So what's happening in terms of the balance of money now invested in private equities versus public equities? If you get rid of the bond side of it, because this is more related to equities, which has grown in share of total investment dramatically. Private equity. And so I think private equity is a superior structure because you don't have the insanities of the expectations market. Now, you do have periodic insanity, right? Privately held pre-IPO company. You can think about the big expectation event, but they don't every quarter have to engage in really stupid stuff. So I think my prediction, and I've been saying this for some time, is I think we're going to look back. If we're going to look ahead to the year 2100 or 2080, we're going to look back on the period kind of 1940 to 2020 as this odd and quaint period where we had this funny belief that the widely held publicly traded corporation was the superior and optimal form of corporate organization. And we'll just laugh and say, what were we thinking? This is like so stupid and useless. It was a terrible structure, and we'll have many more private and semi-private companies. Like I think the corporate form that's going to come back and is already and is in Canada, right, is the semi-private, semi-public company, the company that's really owned and controlled by an entrepreneur, a business person, a Ted Rogers-y type of person, and the shareholders are just along. The public shareholders are just along for the ride, and they should get treated that way. It's sort of like no hanky-panky, no kind of conflict of interest, double dealing, but they have almost no say whatsoever in the corporation's investment decisions and all of that. It's sort of like if you want to bet with us, like this would be like Morgan Mellon, Rockefeller. If you want to bet along with us, fine, but just shut up and stay over in the corner there. Don't say anything, and I'm going to try and kind of do as best as possible, and you'll share in the upside. But if you start whining and complaining, I'll kick you out of the company. I think I think we're in an era where public shareholders are treated way better than they should ever be treated. Right, as if what they think matters. It doesn't. They don't know anything.
Would you include the big pension funds in that?
See, I'm hopeful that there's all of this stuff is complicated and there's wheels within wheels. I have some high hopes for pension funds because once again, Peter Drucker was right in 1976. He said America is going to be saved by pension fund socialism. He said the workers are going to be satisfied with a capitalist system because they're going to end up owning the means of production through their pension funds, which are going to become the biggest stock market participants. And as they said in 1956, knowledge worker, what's a knowledge worker? They said in 1976, yeah, that's stupid. And of course, 25 years later, this is the Drucker approach. He would say something that seemed ridiculous and stupid at the time. Everybody said it was ridiculous and stupid, and then 25 years later, everybody accepts it as an absolute fact. And so 1976, pension fund socialism, that's in fact happened. So the pension funds are the biggest kind of owner of capital. They have an inherent interest, long interest, which I like. So they don't have a long-short kind of interest. So even if they make money short selling some stock, it's bad for them actually because they just want up long. That's it, and they have a very long time horizon, and so they have the best incentives to be doing the right thing vis-a-vis the real market versus the expectation market. So that's the good news. And so I've spent a lot of time, like I give these talks, I go all around the world giving these talks to pension funds to try and get them to change how they because right now they're doing exactly the wrong things. They're voting all their proxies for more stock-based compensation because of the alignment theory, and I'm trying to convert that and having some success. I mean, at least getting them to sort of get worried, which is a start. So I think they have enough capital, and a bunch of them, the Canadian ones especially, I think, are really managed by people who seem to have a kind of real sense of stewardship for the economy. So that's good. Some of the Americans, ones a little less so, because too many of them on the there's too many of these scandals of them on the taking money from the hedge funds to invest in them. But that's the good news. The good news is that they're big. There's a chance for them to kind of do something important. What's the downside? The downside is you could argue, if you wanted, that they're the soft underbelly of modern capitalism. Because what form of organization are most pension funds? Most pension funds are monopolies. They've been conferred, typically by a government, a monopoly right to serve. So you people here in the classroom, do you have a choice where that money they take out of your check every month for pension goes to? Can you say, no, I don't want CPPIB managing that. I want somebody else managing that. Do you have that option? If you're an Ontario teacher, do you have that option? If you're an Ontario municipal worker, do you have that option? If you're a BC teacher, do you have that option? If you're a 3M employee, do you have that option? No. And so the problem is, the rule about monopolies that you should always have in your mind is monopolies, in the end, over the course of time, serve only themselves, not their customers. Right? Think about it. So if your electricity doesn't show up one day at your sockets, and you phone up and say, hey, I got a problem, what do you get told? Essentially, we'll come when it's convenient to us. You have to be home all day, and we might come in the morning, but we might come in the afternoon, and if we get really busy, we might tell you that we didn't come, and we're going to come the next day. They organize to serve themselves, and so I think we need a bit of a pension fund kind of revolution where pension funds are made to compete, and they're not given a monopoly right to serve. Because they're the soft underbelly. If at the end of the whole line you need them to exercise positive stewardship, and they're a monopoly with no market discipline whatsoever, I worry a little bit about that. That's why this is very complicated. Like there are wheels within wheels here, and you gotta keep pulling the string, and to get to the other side. Thank you for your great questions. That's terrific. Thanks so much. Hey, my pleasure. My pleasure.